this screencast, we'll be looking at trade creation and trade diversion, the effects of a high level of economic integration. We'll use the context of Croatia's membership of the EU and the consequences of Croatia becoming a member of the customs union after entry to the EU. At this stage, it's probably worth stating that if you are unsure of the concepts of trade creation, trade diversion and the use of tariffs to protect trade, I suggest you watch these screencasts on these topic areas before proceeding. When Croatia joined the EU, the effects of the high level of economic integration would be dependent on the relative efficiency of Croatian producers in comparison to producers both within the EU but also external to the EU. Also, it would depend on the PED and PES in domestic markets. And we're going to show a market, but clearly the concept will be valid for all markets in Croatia. The size of the tariff or the common external tariff imposed by the EU would also influence the effects of economic integration. We're going to look at these in turn using the diagrams and then point out how these might be used to provide some evaluative opportunities. We'll start with a diagram that may be familiar if you've watched the trade diversion and trade creation screencasts. Here we're going to use the market for lamb, and we're going to show the domestic market in Croatia for lamb. Before entry to the EU, the Croatian market may well have experienced import penetration from lamb from New Zealand. New Zealand producers would be producing at the lowest cost, and the price of lamb in Croatia would be increased by the tariff imposed on lamb imported from New Zealand. This can be shown by the diagram with PNZ plus tariff. And the tariff rate is the difference between the price without the tariff and the price with the tariff. Now we'll focus on the price on the EU market. Once a tariff is abolished, and assuming perfectly elastic supply from the EU market, abolishing a tariff on EU producers now diverts trade to trade within the EU, and the source of imports diverts from New Zealand to the EU. The price Croatian consumers pay for lamb now falls from PNZ plus the tariff to the new price of PEU, but they're consuming EU-produced lamb. Consumption levels increase to Q3, so there's an increase from Q1 to Q3, quantity of lamb consumed. Domestic producers are affected by the tariff being removed on EU producers because there's a contraction of domestic supply and less is supplied by domestic producers in Croatia. They supply Q4 and that's fallen from Q2. Domestic welfare gains are shown by the Area 2 and the Area 4, and domestic welfare losses are shown by Area 5. This is just a recap of the effects of trade diversion. If New Zealand lamb producers are much more efficient than EU producers, the diagram clearly shows that there's a greater welfare loss when trade's diverted. Now I'm making this a little more simplified by maintaining the tariff rate on New Zealand producers that ensures that the price plus tariff is still above the EU price. Now clearly, as long as that is the case, there will be greater welfare losses associated with trade diversion than gains. Domestic welfare loss occurs when Area 5 outweighs Area 2 and 4, and I'm showing this that the loss is more significant when New Zealand producers are much more efficient than EU producers, and this can be shown by the increasing size of Area 5 when the cost of production in New Zealand are much lower. But if the cost of production in New Zealand are actually quite similar to the EU but still slightly lower, trade will be diverted to EU producers when there's a tariff still applied, or a common and external tariff applied to New Zealand producers but removed from EU producers. But the welfare loss is affected, and the gain may well still outweigh the loss of welfare, and so there might actually be an overall improvement in welfare in the domestic market, because areas 2 plus 4 outweigh area 5 when the cost of production in New Zealand are actually quite close to the cost of production in the EU. Clearly it would be unwise to try and attempt to show all of that on one diagram, and this should lead to some form of comment on the extent to which economic integration will lead to welfare gains or welfare losses in the Croatian economy. I'm just showing 3 examples here of comment that could be produced after a preceding analysis. The reference to "it depends whether or not trade is created or trade is diverted" would be an option. Clearly the greater welfare gains are likely to occur when trade is created rather than diverted. However, don't discount the possibility that trade that is diverted can still generate a welfare gain within Croatia, and this may well be ultimately beneficial. We'll now look at the price elasticity of demand and the price elasticity of supply in the domestic market. We'll still use the market for lamb in Croatia. So we're representing the supply of lamb domestically in Croatia and the domestic demand for lamb in Croatia. Now what we'll do is we'll consider the possibility that domestic supply and domestic demand conditions can change. And in this case what we would be looking at is what will be the outcome if both price elastic demand and price elastic supply became more inelastic. So there's less responsiveness to a change in price both in terms of supply and demand when there's a change in the price of lamb. So in this case, clearly the welfare gains of area 2 and area 4 seem smaller than if the price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply elastic. So this will have an impact on the level of welfare. Now, if demand is particularly responsive and supply is particularly responsive to changes in price in the domestic market, the welfare gains are likely to be greater and much more likely to outweigh welfare losses represented by area 5. So we can look back at this and say, well, clearly we could make a comment therefore on the effects of economic integration by looking at the responsiveness of domestic demand and domestic supply to changes in the price of lamb. So I'm going to give 3 examples here of how you could extend this. Again, all of this would be very difficult to show on one diagram. It would be important to make clear statements about the impact of economic integration and take an opportunity to be evaluative about the extent to which welfare in Croatia will be enhanced through higher levels of economic integration. Now we'll turn our attention to the size of the tariff or the common external tariff utilised by the EU. We use the same example, but clearly we have a tariff imposed on New Zealand lamb, and if we assume that the common external tariff was the same, the outcome would be the same price available on the EU market, because abolishing the tariff on the EU producers would bring the price down to PEU, and if the CET were the same size as the existing tariff, there would be no change in outcome. It would be a diversion of trade from New Zealand to the EU. However, obviously New Zealand producers are still more efficient. So if the CET is the same size as the original tariff before entry to the EU, the outcome would be shown clearly by this diagram. However, the CET that Croatia adopts will be determined by all members of the EU, and it might well be lower than the tariff already utilised by or existing in Croatia. So this means the price of New Zealand lamb will fall because in the Croatian market because of a reduction in the size of the tariff applied. Adopting a lower tariff rate in place in the EU will reduce the price down to price NZ plus the CET. Now this would lead to trade creation and not trade diversion, because the trade would already be existing with New Zealand. It just create more trade with New Zealand by reducing the price consumers pay domestically for New Zealand lamb. There's no diversion to EU producers. There's a significant increase in quantity consumed up to quantity Q3. Domestic producers obviously produce less. There's a contraction of domestic supply to Q4 from Q2. The total quantity of imports increases, but consumers can consume a greater quantity at Q3 at the lower prices. There's an extension of demand. Now, in this case, this clearly shows the advantages of trade creation, because when trade is created, there is no loss of welfare due to changing or switching supply to higher cost producers within the EU. Now we'll turn our attention to providing a comment on the effects of economic integration. I'm going to use 3 examples. Clearly it would be very useful if you were to state and explain the consequences of economic integration in the context, and obviously recognise opportunities to be evaluative in doing so. I've used the examples of where the CETs are relatively low. It's much more likely a trade would be created, and also it depends on the size of the CET in relation to the original rate of tariff protection utilised by the Croatian government before membership of the EU. The last one is really a general point about the market-based model that we're using, and the fact that with no tariffs, this simple model would suggest that the greatest gains are to be had when tariffs are eliminated. And that concludes this screencast on the effects of economic integration in the context of becoming a member of the EU and therefore a member of the customs union, using the entry to the EU of Croatia as an example.